Welcome back. In this section, we're going to be talking about some advanced topics in CSS, and I'm going to start off with the critical render path. What is that? Well, we always should know how things work underneath the hood so we can make our websites as fast and reliable as possible. So based on what we've built in the previous section, let's look at what's happening underneath the hood. We are going to our website, and ideally our website will be on a server, and I'll show you how to do that later on in the course. For now, it's just our computer, but let's pretend we have a server where our files are hosted. When we go to our website, we'll call it coolwebsite.com, we request the HTML file, and the browser now sees our HTML file. Reads through this document, and as it's looking through, it notices that, oh, I need a CSS file here. So it goes back, makes another request, and says, hey, can you please give me a CSS file as well? The server says, yep, no problem. Let me grab that for you. Grabs the CSS file. And now it starts looking at both the HTML and the CSS file to try and figure out how the web page should look. But then it also notices that, hold on a second, I need some fonts as well. So it goes to this address and looks for a font. Again, the website now asks the website that the fonts are hosted at. In our case, it's the Google API, and it grabs the font file. Now here's the thing. While it's grabbing the font file, it could render the page, and rendering means displaying. So it could display the website if it only has the HTML and CSS, but it might not show up the text because the text is looking for the font file. So when we talk about the critical render path, we like to mention that CSS is a render blocking file. So you won't be able to render a web page until you receive your CSS. And sometimes if you have font files, you'll also have to wait for the text to render on the page. So keep that in mind when you build your websites. But what are things that we can consider when doing this so that our websites load up faster? One is maybe to have our own font files. Another one might be that you don't want to make your CSS too big. If we had hundreds and hundreds of lines of code of CSS, well, the file gets bigger and bigger, and it's more and more that you have to transfer over the wire. One method that people have used, and you'll see often, is something called minifying your CSS. And if we open up a browser here, you can do something called CSS minify. And CSS minify, what it does is you can enter your CSS here. You can see an example over here. So you enter this, and you click minify. And what minify does, it removes all the white space. So everything is on one line, just really tiny together. So even though it's the same CSS, it technically makes the file a little bit smaller so that the number of bytes that you're sending over the internet is a lot less. And you'll see that technique used in JavaScript as well, and we'll talk about that in that section. But that is the critical render path, a path that a website takes to display something to the user. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Hello! Let's build a fun image portfolio site. One of the biggest problems that people have, and the hardest problem with CSS, it's always making sure that we have our items displayed in the location that we want. That is a really, really difficult problem. And there are many, many solutions to this problem, but one of the new ways, and now it's probably the most popular way, is called Flexbox. And we're going to be using that to create a beautiful image website. Let's get started. So I have an index.html file here and a style.css file in the same directory on my desktop. So let's get started with our typical HTML file. We're going to title it CSS, and in the body we're going to have a header of life in the wild, and refresh. Perfect. And in here, we're going to have a div with a class of container. We'll close that off. And in here, let's add some images. Now, if you remember with images, I can type in this and then tab with Sublime Text. And we don't have any pictures yet. So for now, let's just copy and paste and add 6 images. Save and refresh. Okay. Let's start adding some of these images, and I actually have a file full of these images for you, and I'll attach it to the next lesson so you can also build it yourself. So I'm just going to copy these quickly. Phew, that was a lot of copy and pasting. Let's save that and refresh. All right, we have our images and they're massive. So let's make this a little bit smaller. We can now go to our style sheet and we can select the images, and let's just do width 450 pixels and height 300 pixels. And you might be asking yourself, how come we don't do it here on the individual images? And remember, we can add attributes, but that means if we needed to ever change anything, we have to individually go into each image and change it versus just changing in one location. So for now, we're going to stick to the CSS size. Let's save that and refresh. And obviously, we need to link the file. So let's add a link here, and it will reference our style.css. Save that and refresh. There you go. We have our images. Look at that. Some beautiful animals here. Now, Flexbox has a great resource, obviously from CSS Tricks, and this is pretty much all you need. It shows you all the things that Flexbox can do, and as you can see, it allows you to play around with content and shift it around in a very nice way. I'm going to attach this link for you at the end of this video, and you can take a look for yourself. For now, let's learn a few Flexbox properties. We want to define that everything inside of this div is part of Flexbox. It's called container, so let's do container. And within this container, we will say that display will be flex. So that's how we activate Flexbox. Refresh. Okay, we have a few changes, which is nice, but I don't want to scroll through this. Ideally, I can see everything without scrolling. So if one thing we want to do, and again, we can look down over here at the suggestion, we see that flex wrap might be something that we want to add. So let's do flex wrap and do wrap, save and refresh. Okay, that's perfect. So if I make this bigger, you see that everything is wrapping around. Okay, but I think the content should be centered. It kind of looks weird to having everything to the left over here. So again, we can do something called justify content, and then we can do center. And refresh. Perfect. And if we look on the guide over here, justify content should be right over here. You can see all the properties that it has. That looks pretty good, and we did that pretty fast. Made a nice little portfolio website already. What else can we add now that we have this flexible container around our website? Let's make the header a little bit prettier than it is now. So that's the H1. We can add an H1 here, and we'll say that the font family is, I like this one, Fantasy. Save and refresh. Ooh, I like that one. Font size, let's make it a little bit bigger. We'll do 3 EM. So if you don't remember what EM is, make sure you check out that video. Okay, so that looks better. Maybe it'll be nice to have a bit of a border as well. So we can do border bottom because we only want a border on the bottom. And we'll do 2 pixels solid pink. And refresh. Okay, perfect. That looks good, but ideally I want a border just around this. I don't want the entire section, so we can actually just say that for H1, we want the width to be 400 pixels. I save and refresh. All right, perfect. That looks good. And ideally, this is centered so that the line underneath it is, well, on the left side and right side is equally distributed. So we can do something like text align center. And you'll notice here that it's aligned in the center, but not the web page center. It's aligned in the center of the width of 400 pixels. But that looks good. It'll be actually nice to have a border around here as well. So let's add border right 2 pixels solid pink. Save and refresh. All right, that looks very nice. And then the final thing I want to add is I want to have some spacing between these images. So I'm going to add a margin of 10 pixels here and refresh. All right, let's take a look at our website right now. That looks very, very nice. As you can see, Flexbox is a very easy thing to implement, and it makes your websites look really, really nice, and you can position your content very easily, especially if you have these container-like structures. I want to show you one last resource for Flexbox. Again, this is a tool that you'll see more and more of, and ideally you'll build websites using Flexbox instead of some of the older ways. One way to get really, really good at Flexbox is to play this game, and it's called Flexbox Froggy, I believe. Let's see. And here you're trying to get the frog onto the leaf, its little home. So you can do something like justify content flex end, and look at that. You get the frog onto the leaf, and you move on to the next round. I'll leave this for you. It's a really, really good way to learn Flexbox. I think this is probably the best way to do layout in CSS. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Welcome back. In this video, we're going to be talking about CSS 3. Now, just like with HTML and HTML5, CSS is a standard that constantly evolves to adapt to new demands of websites. So CSS 3 is the latest evolution of CSS, where we've added new properties and new features so that we can make our design even better. So if you remember in our diagram over here, all of these browsers have different developers, different teams that work on implementing their features. Now, in an ideal world, everybody agrees on what CSS does, and when new features and new properties are added, everybody implements them at the same time. But that's simply not the case. Some browsers might work with some property, some might not, because they haven't gotten around to making it work. So let's go back to our website. Now let's play with one of my favorite CSS3 properties. How cool would it be if when we hover over these pictures, the picture moves? Well, with CSS3, they've introduced something called transition. And if I do all 1 second, and I'll explain what that does in, well, 1 second. Image hover, so this should be familiar, where when we hover, we want the image to transform. This is a new property as well, and we'll say scale 1.1. So let's see what happens. I refresh. Look at that. My images are now moving on hover. Isn't that cool? What these properties do is say that I want the image to transition when an action is taken upon it, and I want all the properties to transition over 1 second. And what's that transition going to be? Well, when I hover, I want it to transform by a scale of 1.1. So it's essentially growing. If I change this to 4 seconds and I refresh, well, now it takes 4 seconds for the image to scale. You can see over here, I'm going to change this back to 1 second, just because it looks better that way. If I make this website full screen, you see that we now have a beautiful effect for our image gallery. There's also another property called animation, which you can look at on your own. But again, CSS3 has brought in a lot of these new properties to make websites even more dynamic than they are now. But there is a little caveat to using such properties. And that is, you want to make sure that each browser has implemented a new feature. So if I go to one of our favorite websites, W3 Schools, they have a CSS browser support reference. And here you can look at all the CSS to make sure that browsers support whatever property you want to use. So if we go to transition, we see that it is supported by all latest browsers. But you also see that if we go to something like user select, they have this MS, Moz, WebKit line over it. And if we scroll all the way down, it'll show you that it is supported by Internet Explorer with prefix MS. What does that mean? Well, these are browser prefixes, and you'll see them every once in a while. What it is these are new features of CSS that haven't fully been implemented by the browsers, and you want to use a prefix to make sure that they work as an experimental feature in the browser. Let me explain what that means. If I wanted to add let's say a box shadow, so that means kind of making this look 3D and having a shadow underneath the edge over here, previously I had to do something like this, where I put box shadow, and you can read into the property to see what I'm about to do, but I'm going to do 4 pixels, 4 pixels, 5 pixels, and then the color, which is a bit of a gray. So if I do this and refresh, well, that looks nice, and my browser is the new Chrome, so it has this feature. But a few years ago, when box shadow was first introduced, you had to do something like this. Box shadow. And then copy and paste this. And this makes sure that it works on the Mozilla browser. And then you also had MS, which made sure that it works on Internet Explorer. You had WebKit, which made sure that it works on Safari and Chrome. And then finally, you also had O, which made it work on the Opera browser. And then you also had to still mention the box shadow without the prefixes at the bottom. So now, if any of these browsers don't support box shadow, well, they have these prefixes so that it should work. And box shadow has been some time now, so you don't need to do this anymore. But there is one great way of seeing if a certain property still needs browser prefixes, and that is using something like this reference, which I will leave for you so you can check it out. Another thing I wanted to show you is Can I Use? So caniuse.com is a great resource to see anything that you might want to try out. So if I type in here CSS transition, you'll see CSS3 transitions are supported in all these browsers, except we have one, Opera Mini, and it says it's 2.63% of the global usage. So if you use CSS3 transitions, 2.63% of the population might not be able to see it. Now, whether that is your user base or not, you can kind of decide what the trade-offs are. But this is a great thing to use. And if we use something like Flexbox, well, we see that Flexbox has all support. It shouldn't be a problem for you to use it. Okay, let's go back to this and just finish up this website to make it look nice. So I don't like that there's space here. Ideally, this is all the way to the left, but if I do margin 0 pixels and I refresh, that actually doesn't change much because sometimes browsers have their own default margins. So the way to get around it is to do margin 0 for the body. So margin 0 pixels. Let's save and refresh. Perfect. Now we have this all the way to the left. Okay, but we do want a bit of a buffer at the top. So I'm going to add margin top, and we'll do 10 pixels. Save and refresh. Perfect. Now we have a beautiful website. And it didn't really take us much. We just wrote a few lines of CSS, a few lines of HTML, and look what we have. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. And welcome back. Whenever you have a request from an employer to build a website or a web app, one of the first things that they will ask for is to make sure that your website is responsive. So what is responsive UI? Well, I can show you by opening up the developer tools, which we should know by now. And you'll see over here that there is a little phone icon. If we click on this, it will show you what your website will look like on, let's say, an iPhone. Let's make this a little bit bigger. So let's do 100% of the size. Perfect. You'll see that your website on an iPhone looks like this. And if we do an iPad, well, it looks like this. And if it rotates, it looks good. So responsive means that your website, no matter what, whether it's on the big screen or something like an iPad, it is responsive. That means there's no cutoffs. Everything looks good no matter what size the screen is. So if we go back to our website and close the developer tabs, I can actually play around with this, open and close, and see that it's responsive. The website looks good no matter what the size, and users can enjoy the experience and not be turned off because whether they're accessing it through their iPad at home on their couch, it still looks good. So keep that in mind. Responsive UI should be a priority when building websites. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Hello. This is your new robot friend, and I have a fun little challenge for you. I've created this robot that is actually pretty cool. So as you hover, his head grows big, and he can also dance. Now, here's the challenge. I've created majority of this robot, but you first need to assemble it so it looks like this. I've left a few files for you, an index file and a CSS file. The only problem is that these parts are all over the page and I need you to assemble them so that you can have a robot friend as well. In the following section, after the exercise, I'll have the solution that you can use, but give it a try and hopefully you'll have a new robot friend too.